Clifford Bates, and welcome once again to Reading Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics. We're continuing our examination of Book 7 and starting with his kind of responses to the Chapter 3 today, responding to the perplexities that he raised in Chapter 2. Chapter 2, he lists a number of perplexities, or Socratic refutations, Socratic sophistic kind of responses and arguments, and now he's kind of responding to them in a certain way, giving answers. Now he's going to give an example. So let's go look at chapter 3. This is chapter 3. First, then, is to examine whether those who act without self-restraint do so knowingly or not, and how they might do so knowingly. The question is whether they act without self-restraint, do they do so knowingly or not? And how might they do so knowingly, right? One must set down the sort of things that the persons lacking self-restraint and the self-restraint are concerned with. So we must first, before we do this question, we must set down the things that the person who lacks self-restraint are concerned with. I mean, whether they are concerned with every pleasure and pain or with certain particular ones. So is it every pleasure and pain or the specific ones? And as regard to the self-restrained and the steadfast, whether they are the same person or different. And similarly for all the other points belonging to this study. Now, or contemplation, theoria. In other words, what we're doing is we're engaged not with action, but with theoria. Saying contemplation. There's a contemplation here. We're concerned with this contemplation, thinking about these things. This is a theoria in that sense. We're thinking about it. We're contemplating. We're not doing. We're contemplating it. And therefore, there are certain things. The question here is, what are we to do? How are they? What are there? Every pains or only particular ones? But then the question is the self-restrained and steadfast the same person, or whether they are the same person or different? And all the other points belonging to this contemplation. So the starting point of this examination is whether the arche of this examination is whether the self-restrained person and the person lacking self-restraint are distinguished by what they are concerned with, or by the way in which they are so concerned. In other words, what defines it? Is it the what or the way? I think this is why he highlights it. And they italicize the what and the way. Is it what starting point of this discussion? Is it regarding the self-restrained person and the person lacking this are distinguished? Is it by the what they're concerned with or the way they're concerned? I mean this. Whether it is solely by being concerned with these things, is it solely by their being concerned with these things, or those things that the person is lacking in self-restraint? Or is it solely concerned with those things, or those things that the person is lacking in self-restraint? So is it person with the solely concerned with those things, concerned whether the person who are self-restraint are that, or is it only the things that the person is lacking self-restraint? Or is it, or if that is not the case, then instead, because of the way in which he is so concerned. So is it that the things that they are concerned with, or those are they different things? The things, and therefore this with the things that they are concerned, or if therefore therefore they are concerned with different things, or is it the way? If it's not, that is not the case. It's not the different things. It is the way, instead the way in which one is concerned, or if not that, then instead of or if not that, so that's not the way, then instead as a result of both considerations. Okay, this is okay. So that's the first thing, right? This is the first start. So what is the way we have to do it? The question is it? I mean this whether it's by solely concerned with those things that this person or that person does it, or not that, then is it the way? Or if it's not that, if it's not that, then instead as a result of both considerations. So that's first starting point. Second, one must examine whether lack of self-restraint and self-restraint pertains to all things or not. So does it pertain to all things or not? For the person lacking self-restraint in an unqualified sense is not concerned with all things, but rather with those with which the licentious person is concerned. So there's a contradiction. In other words, the person lacking in other words, person lacking in unself-restraint in an unqualified sense is not concerned with all things, but mostly concerned with the things that the licentious person is concerned with. Okay, nor is he lacking self-restraint simply because by being concerned with these things. In that case, lack of self-restraint would be the same thing as licentiousness. In other words, if it's simply because he's concerned with those things, in other words, there's a connection, there's a correlation between the person lacking self-restraint and the things that the licentious person tends to live. There's a correlation, but there's not in other words, but they're not the same thing. Because if they were simply the same, if the lacking of self-restraint is simply because he's concerned with those things, then there would be no difference between the licentious and the one who's self-restrained. Right? This leads us to that problem earlier: the sophosounos, the lack of sophosounos, the one who's immoderate, and then that. Okay, this is not the same in that sense as he discussed earlier. Right? A fourth, licensed person is led on by what he chooses, holding that he ought always to pursue the present pleasure. Whether the person lacking self-restraint does not think that, he pursues the pleasure anyways, right? So that's the problem. The licentious person is simply just he chooses it, but he chooses it whether he does. In other words, the licentious person is led on by what he chooses, holding on to what he ought always to pursue, the pleasant pleasure. Whether that person lacking self-restraint does not think that, but pursues that pleasure anyways, right? Doesn't think that he should do that, but doesn't. Like they're not the same in that sense. For as for as for its being true opinion, but not science or knowledge, against which those who lack self-restraint act. In other words, as for it being true opinion and not science or knowledge, against which those who lack self-restraint act. It makes no difference to the argument. So therefore, this question of in other words, here's a very interesting thing. It's a question of whether it's true opinion but not science that by which they choose to act, which self-restraint that against which those who lack self-restraint act. That's not relevant here. For some people, when they opine about something, are without hesitation, but think they know things precisely. So that some people opine and they act without hesitation, they think they know things precisely. If then those who opine will act contrary to their conviction more than those who opine will act more contrary to their conviction more than do those who possess science solely on account of having a weak conviction, right? Again, the position here. Note, not the word translated as, not the word usually translated as conviction, hypomene in related terms, but pistosumen, which is, as also is the next clause in the sentence, convinced of, which can also mean to trust and have faith. Okay, I would wish they don't do this. This is another thing, conviction here. Why do you use conviction? I would not use conviction. Why don't you say, be more literal, do more of this, have trust or faith in. other words, on account of they having weak faith or uh, uh, or 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 trust. They lack in trust. They lack in faith in for having weak. In other words, they possess solely on their account of having that. Then, as a matter of fact, science will not differ from uh, 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 will not be superior to opinion. In other words, if that's the case, then they won't be. They won't make a difference between this in that sense. For some are no less convinced of what they opine about than are other people of what they know. 16 episteme, epistene, epistene, to know scientifically, to know by science, right? Here is the next two sentences. This is the know, this is the know by conviction, know by science. I wish they would be more literal here. The literalness matters. In other words, it doesn't matter whether they know that they're acting like this, and that the question that they doesn't matter whether they know through science or that they lack conviction. It doesn't make the difference if they know it through this. I make a guess at it, or I know scientifically. Both are going to not do it like that. Therefore, in that sense, and if they, you know, and science will not differ from opinion, belief, or trust. Will not differ from or number 15 here is not superior to, will not be opinion. Docs, in other words, science will not be superior to opinion. For some are no less convinced by what they opine than other people of what they know, right? What they know scientifically, designed through science. And Heraclitus makes this clear. 17, the famous pre-Socratic Heraclitus, that he says, the precise reference is unclear, but some commentators suggest that he may be allude to Heraclitus's or Leclerc's style of arguing, in itself a response to the impossibility of certain knowledge of the world, that it's in flux. In other words, that it's not, it's the Heraclitus, right? The reference to Heraclitus will make this clear that it's too complex. You can't know with certainty. But since we say to know, scientifically know, right, in two senses, but since we say to know in two senses, the person who has the science but is not using it, and he who uses it are said to know scientifically, uses it with knowledge to know, and that's science to know. It will make no difference whether someone who does what he ought not not what he does what he ought not to do, has the relevant knowledge, but is not actively contemplating it, theorizing it, or whether he is actively contemplating it. In other words, it doesn't matter if he's actively contemplating or not actively contemplating if he doesn't do what he said. In other words, he doesn't do what he ought. For this latter does not seem to be a terrible thing, but not so if he is not actively contemplating. In other words, but not so if he is not actively contemplating the science he nevertheless has. In other words, he has the science. He doesn't. In other words, if he is an ignorant person, it's not. The latter is not a terrible thing in that sense. If he's not active, he does this. The person who does something, but this bad opinion, doesn't have he's not contemplating it, but doesn't do it. Right? Okay. There's this, but not as if he is, but not so if he is not actively contemplating. In other words, I have the I have the science. I know how the science is, but I choose not to use it. Okay, that's the difference here. The last sentence here is that the first, who doesn't have it, who just simply submits to it, this is not as blameworthy as the one who has it but chooses not to do it, and then goes with his passions. Right? That's this. This is the way that goes. Further, since there are two kinds of premises, namely the universal and the particular, right? The starting point, the particular premises. the universal and the particular. Nothing prevents someone who holds both from acting contrary to the science he possesses, because he makes use of the universal premise, but not the particular one. Matters of action being, of course, particulars, right? So therefore, he makes use of the general thing, but not the particular one. So two premises here. There's nothing prevents someone who holds both of these acting contrary, because he has this principle, but doesn't take the particular principle, right? So that because he makes use of the universal principle, but not the particular one. Matters of action being, of course, particulars. There is also a relevant difference pertaining to the universal premise. For there is a universal relating to a person. In other words, for there is the universal relating to the person himself, and the one relating to the matter concerned at hand. So there's two principles here. There is one to the, there's two there is the universal relating to the person, the man himself, right, and relating to the matter of concern. For example, that dry foods are advantageous for every human being is, and that he himself is a human being. Okay, these are two things that dry foods are advantage of this, and that he is himself a human being, or that this sort of thing here is dry. Okay, that's the general principle, and here is the particular thing, that this dry, or maybe even that this is kind of a general statement too, that this thing is dry, this thing is particular knowledge. Those are general, these are particular, right? And as to whether this particular food here is of a particular character, however, the person lacks self-restraint, either does not have knowledge of, or is not exercising it. In other words, if I don't, in other words, I know this is true, but I just eat this thing that is dry anyways, right? In other words, dry foods. It's wet. It's not advantageous. I don't care whether it's dry or not. I know that it's dry. I know that I what does he says here? And whether the particular food here is of a particular character, however, the person lacks self-restraint, either does not have the knowledge or is not exercising it. And so, given these different ways of knowing, a massive difference will arise. In other words, different ways of knowing. I know the particular thing. I know this. I know, therefore, I can either. There's four options here. I am either I know it, or I know the in other words, the universal in particular. Universal in particular. I know it or I don't know it. I know it. I don't know it. So it's I know no. I don't know. I don't know. I know and don't know. I don't know and know. But then I know it and then do it, and I know it. In other words, all these things then leads us to another level of criteria. So therefore, the knowing and not knowing is four, but then of those four, there is additional two options of each, right? Actually, not then the do I do it, or I don't do it, right? That's so different ways of knowing, massive differences will arise, such as the person lacking self-restraint to know in one way, that is to know the particular the principle relevant universal, but not know to or to be activating his knowledge of a particular given particular, seems to be nothing strange. But in the other way, that is knowing and having active in him both kinds of premises, it would indeed be a cause. In other words, I know and have active in him. In other words, I know both, and I know the things that I engage in that activity, but then I don't do it. Right. So there's the knowing or not knowing, of it, having or not having the ability, then having it, but then exercise, engaging in it and not doing it, and then the question of do I submit to it? In other words, this is that weird thing. In other words, having knowing and having active, knowing and having active in him both kinds of premises, it would be the cause of wonder. Now, 18 is a big note here because, as Aquinas says, it is possible for a man to know both habitually and actively. So there's two ways of knowing. There's something habitual and active. The universal considered in itself, but either he does not grasp the universal considered in this particular object, i.e., the universal is not known in a habitual way, or he does not bestir himself. The universal is not actually known. Therefore, it does not seem unreasonable for a man who acts incontinently without self-restraint to have one kind of knowledge via the universal alone in particular. If it's habitual and not actual, but it would be unreasonable for the man who acts constantly, that is with self-restraint, to have kinds of knowledge, and it would seem unreasonable for man to have who act constantly with self-restraint to have another kind of knowledge, i.e., actual concern with this particular. In other words, they have different. In other words, this is the ordinary. This is how he explains this passage. This is a very complicated passage here. This is why it has the concern. This is confusing. Further, another way of having science differ from those just now mentioned is available for human beings. In other words, there's another way of having science, different from those just mentioned here, is available. For in the case of having but not using science, we see that the having is different. Having it but not using it is different, such that a person both has it in a way and does not have it. For example, someone who is asleep, mad, or drunk. In other words, 19 here is the particular term is hexis, is translated as characteristic, right? Hexis. This is weird that he uses hexis. Having the thing, possessing, hexis in that sense, right? Aristotle is making use of the fact that the noun is derived from the verb meaning, among other things, to have, right? Having. The having, to eshtain. The hexis is in other words, derived from the verb of this. It's a noun derivative of a verb. See, and in fact, this is why the glossary is interesting. So hexis, this is why he uses hexis here, because it's a nice linguistic trick. It is he's using it in a way to point to the verb, right? Uses that hexis is different, that the character is different, that the having of it is different. Such a person, both in his way, does not have it. For example, someone who is asleep, mad, and drunk, right? This is, in other words, I'm asleep, mad, and drunk. I possess it, but I'm not able to exercise because I'm sleeping. I'm mad on my passions, or I'm drunk, right? But surely those in the grasp of passions are disposed in this way. So therefore, like the drunk man, the passion person is like this. An outburst of spiritedness, the sexual desires, and a certain other such things clearly brings about a change in the body too. And some people think they can cause madness. In other words, an outburst, a chemical outburst, something that affects the body. In other words, what? It's spiritedness, anger, anger. A sexual desire, and other things can be a kind of madness, frenzy, right? And it is clear then that those lacking in self-restraint must be said to be in a state similar to such people. In other words, the lacking of self is a kind of a frenzy. There's lack of control. There's a lack. That the frenzy of some passion, something that drives you like this, and that you can't control it. In that sense, there's a kind of like a madness, right? That can cause madness and things, and similar to such people. But Stating the arguments that proceed from science is not a sign of anything. In other words, stating the arguments that proceed from science is not a sign of everything. For even people in the groups of these passions state these passions state these passion state this condition state demonstrations in verses of Epidolus, and those who are first learning will put together arguments but do not understand them. So therefore, this is that weird 20. Here, the term here translated as have, no, 20. Epidamus is famous for pre-Socratic philosopher, two poems on nature and purifications survive in fragmentary form. So this is this guy. He brings this metaphor for this guy. In other words, stating the arguments that proceed from science is not a sign of anything. In other words, for even people, passions can repeat something, the statement of words. Just repeating something, repeating the knowledge. Repeating the knowledge or stating the knowledge is not knowing it. Because what? This is the difference. Yeah, just repeating the word. I see this with students who kind of remember the words and give you the words back, or read. They have the text or notes and just read their notes or read the text back to you as the answer, and verbally give you verbatim, but they don't know what it means. That's just the thing. They can repeat the words, but don't know what they mean. That's the difference. That's the difference here. That's the same thing. They repeat, they don't understand, but not understand them. For one must grow naturally into knowledge, and that requires time. Knowledge becomes yours. It must become yours. Knowledge requires it's yours. It's into you. It's part of you. As a result, it must be supposed that those who lack self-restraint speak as actors do. In other words, they speak like actors. Actors simply just repeat lines. They're not their lines. They're not them. It's not them. They're repeating the lines of others. Here is that in this case, it's like an actor. Those who lack self-restraint therefore they repeat the claims of knowledge of the science or that, but then it's not in them in that sense. They don't really know it in that sense. That's another way it's good. Further, someone might also look at the cause of lack of self restraint in terms of nature. So that's another thing. It's a natural thing, right? It's not the question of having the knowledge or not having the knowledge, or not possessing the science or not, right? But there's something. This is now the lack of self restraint is in terms of nature, as follows, right? For the universal premise is an opinion. For the universal premise is an opinion. The other premise concerns particular, over which perception is authoritative from the start. So the particular things, in other words, other things over which perception is authoritative. So in other words, this is the universal premise is an opinion. We don't know, they have no perception of this. But the other premise concerns particular, over which perception is authoritative from the start. And whenever one conclusion arises from the universal and particular premises, the soul must necessarily assert it. But in the case of a conclusion bound up with making or doing things, in other words, this is poesis, right? Making, poesis. Or the question is, should be praxis, to be note here, should be praxis, or doing things. The soul must immediately act. So therefore, the conclusion is that when the conclusion is bound up, in other words, that the particular universal, the soul, whenever the one conclusion arises, the universal and the universe particular premise, the soul must necessarily assert it. But in the case of a conclusion bound up with making something or doing things, the soul must immediately act, right? So therefore, there is a conclusion that rises from the universal. The soul must necessarily assert it, right? But when it's doing with making, that it must do it or make it. For example, if one ought to taste everything sweetly, and this thing here is sweet, And if some particular thing, it being some particular thing, someone who has the who, someone who is so capable and not prevented from doing so, must at the same time necessarily carry out this action. In other words, you must take it. That was this sweet thing. The argument here is that one ought to taste everything sweet, and that this thing here is sweet. Therefore, I must taste it. I must carry out this action. Whenever then the universal present premise is present that forbids us from tasting sweet things, and another universal is also present to the effect that every sweet thing is pleasant. So there's two things. We shouldn't want it. However, this is a problem. Universal premise. Every sweet, we should not taste sweet things. We don't taste sweet things. But another universal is present to the effect that sweet things are pleasant. And this thing here is sweet, and this premise is active. And by chance, the relevant desire is present within us. We want the one premise says to avoid this, but the desire for it leads the way. But the desire for it leads the way, for it is able to set in motion each part of the body. In other words, here's the problem: there's two universal premises that this is sweet, this is pleasant, this is going to be pleasant, but this is not good for us, right? We shouldn't do this. Tasting sweet things is not. We should avoid doing this. Both of these two things are universally true. But the problem is we have the desire we want the pleasant. In other words, that in this case, to the effect that, in other words, and by chance, the relevant desires that we want, pleasant, the desire that is present in us, that we want pleasant. The one premise says avoid this, but the desire leads us away, leads the way, for it is able to set in motion the parts of the body. The desire sets motion. Desire leads motion, causes motion. It turns out, as the result, that someone can come to be without self-restraint by reason account, logos, in a way, and by opinion, an opinion that does not, in other words, it can be self-restrained by a reasoned account, logos, in a way and by opinion, an opinion that is not in itself incidentally contrary to correct reason, for the desire involved, not the opinion, is contrary to correct reason. Desires violates the. It's not the opinion does not leave us to. Not the opinion. It's the desire involved. We have the pleasant to enjoy the pleasant. It's not that the opinion is wrong. That this is sweet. That this is sweet. That this is pleasant. This is not wrong. That is contrary. What is contrary to correct reason is to choose to want. The desire is contrary to correct reason. It's not it's not the opinion. As a result, on this account as well, brute animals do not lack self-restraint because they do not possess a universal conviction, but rather an image and memory of particular things. So therefore, this is very interesting. That animals do not, in other words, the difference between animals is the application of universal. They are able to, I mean, okay, I think this is the point. That animals only sense certain things in memory of particular things. They have an image of a particular thing and a memory of it. And therefore they have this application of these things. And they don't lack self-restraint because they only know that. The lacking of self-restraint requires that there's a connection between a general this higher thing, this general principle, right? The humans using reason to achieve higher forms, the higher knowledge, right? that reason, in other words, human being is able to have this principle, higher, the universe, this higher, from the particular to the universal or the general, right? That they don't have general knowledge. They don't have this general belief, this general knowledge of something. They only have the particular knowledge. So that the particular knowledge doesn't lead them to a connection of the self-restraint. In other words, they do not have self-restraint because they do not possess a universal conviction, but rather merely an image of particular things. But so therefore, this is the next problem. That's a weird thing. It's almost like this whole thing of animals here. It's almost like a footnote, but it's maybe, in other words, this is the human. The difference between the animal and the human here. The human has access to this, and maybe it is this disconnect. Maybe it's this disconnect between a way that there's you can have rational accuracy can happen in the case of logos. That the logos is right, but the reasoning is right. And that the opinion is reasoned correctly. It's that what is the desire is wrong. That that I possess the desire and I want this. The choice is for the desire, or I prefer the desire to that, right? But as to how the ignorance the ignorance involved is undone. In other words, ignorance is not a particular thing; it's the ignorance of these general principles, right? But as to how the ignorance involved here is undone, the person lacking self-restraint becomes again a knower. Becomes again a knower. In other words, they know something. The person lacking becomes a knower. How does it undone? The ignorance is undone because the person lacking self-restraint becomes again a knower. The same argument pertains also to the case of someone drunk or asleep. It is not particular to this experience. An argument one must hear from those who study nature. In other words, an argument one must hear from those who study nature. There's the sleep and the drunk and the sleep. This is a very important case. It's you know it, but you still do it anyways, right? That is done because of in other words, it's a knower. It becomes a knower again. The same argument pertains to also to the case of someone drunk, right, and asleep. And now, since the final premise is both an opinion pertaining to an object of perception and authoritative over our actions, perception, there was an object of perception, and this is authoritative over action. Someone in the grip of the relevant passion either does not have this final premise or has it in such a way that his having it does not amount to his here again that we know it scientifically, that we know it like science, his knowing it or deducing it, him not being able to achieve it or deduce it scientifically. Instead, he merely speaks as a drunk man states and states the sayings of Empidoles. Again, this is that a reference to a famous saying, right? And because the ultimate term, again, this is the eschatolos holer, it's defining boundary. The ultimate, but this defining, because the defining boundary is not universal and seems not to be knowable as the universal is knowable. It seems also that what Socrates was seeking turns out to be the case, right? There is that given that this is not a knowable, this is a particular, this is not a universal. Therefore, there is an ignorance here. There is an ignorance. So it seems what Socrates was seeking turns out to be the case. For it is not when science in the authoritative sense seems to be present that the experience of lack of self-restraint occurs. In other words, when science in the authoritative sense is present, then there's not lack of self-restraint. It's ignorance. Nor is this science, nor is it this science that is dragged around on account of passions, but rather that knowledge, the knowledge, or this knowledge regarding which is bound up by rather, but rather that other knowledge, that other form of knowing, not scientifically derived knowledge, but this kind of knowledge based on perception and belief, not scientific. In other words, we don't know it absolutely. In other words, this is the difference between the level of opinion versus the level of knowledge. Knowledge, this is a knowledge of about the correct opinions, correct thing. Where this kind of thing which is bound up with perception, the particular things, not of these general principles, but of particular things. So therefore, Socrates is right, because if that's the case in that situation, then it is ignorance, not that. But if it's not, if it's about perception, it's things bound up with perception, then there is something. That's the difference. The things that are bound up by accuracy is about our behavior and actions, about things that are bound with our doing and acting, not about knowing. That's what he says, but rather that thing which is bound up with perception. So about the knower and the non-knower, and how a knower can lack self-restraint, let this much be said. So therefore, this question is this. It's again, this is dealing with the question of the knower and the not knower, and how a knower can have self-restraint, and it is tied to the perception. This problem of not the knowledge but the perception. So let's stop here. Yeah, this has been a long one. So if you have any comments or questions, please put them below, and I will respond to them when I see them. If you like it, hit like button, hit like, because it helps the channel grow and it helps us develop things. Share it far. If you like this video and you want to get attention to others, you can share it far and wide. Share it in social media. Share an account. It helps the algorithm in that sense. It brings attention to the system, so that more people will be able to find it. If you've not subscribed, please consider subscribing, because more as we grow and the channel gets larger, we get more privileges and rights in YouTube, and more options to do things. Another thing you do, if you didn't like it, you can say no. You can thumbs down it, but say why in the comments, so people can learn from it. That maybe I can prove, but also maybe it's people, if I did something wrong, and you want to correct me in that sense, others will be able to discern and learn from this. This is the purpose of this. Is why I'm doing this. If you want to follow me on social media, the links to my social media accounts are below. If you want to know more about me as an academic and a scholar and a researcher, and know more about my research, you can look at my academic social media links below, the social media links. And if you want to help me contribute to what I'm doing here, financially in that sense, you can do so. The links below those of subscribe on Patreon, or you could, another direct way you can do those by going through buying one of my books. My 3 current available books are listed below. You can order them either by your local bookstore. You can buy them if they're at your bookstore. You can buy them, but if you ask your bookstore to order them, or you can order them directly on, order them online through an online bookseller like Amazon, Barnes & Noble, or Libris, or A&E, whatever. And another way you can do so is through ordering it through the bookstore. Not bookstore, but publishers. Not all the publishers can do it so lightly, but particularly those who are interested in my studying the Aristotle's Politics, want a good guide to go through it, look at my notebook for Aristotle's Politics. That is you can order that by Lulu, and if you order from Lulu directly, I will get the money that Amazon and those places get, the profit that they get, I would get. So that's a way that you can help. Okay, that's it. Next time we'll turn to chapter 4. We'll look at chapter 4, continuing the questions of the perplexities. We dealt with the question of today. We dealt with the question of the knower and not knower, and how can a knower lack self-restraint. So we'll next time, I think we'll look at the question of the unqualified, right? The lack of self-restraint and qualified sense, right? Okay, that's it. Take care. Have a good day. See you later. Bye bye.